There are three types of rehabilitation. The first type is rehabilitation by ignorance. Second type is rehabilitation by omission. And third type is rehabilitation by lying. So let's go through each of them first. First type, rehabilitation by ignorance. It's basically when you ignore the facts and use that to fuel your rehabilitation narrative. So for instance, if you're rehabilitating George W. Bush, George Walker Bush, massive war criminal, two wars we had no business being in, one of them completely based on lies and totally illegal, spying, um, spying on Americans, expanding the power of the security state, and doing torture, major human rights violations, tax cuts for the rich, massive deregulation, and near destruction of the economy. But if we want to rehabilitate George W. Bush, we will just ignore all the facts. We'll ignore his major grievances like torture and war crimes and human rights violations, and we'll ignore them and we'll throw them under the rug, and we'll just use a bland, vague language to lie about George W. Bush and say, oh, he's such a funny guy, he's such a great personality. He actually has a terrible personality and he comes off as a total scuzzball. If you don't know what the word scuzzball means, you look it up. You should look it up. It's basically a synonym for the word D-bag. Yeah, but anyway, getting back on topic, when you rehabilitate people like George W. Bush, you just totally ignore all the facts. Because when rehabilitation by ignorance is done for people whose grievances are so massive that you can't really cast them under the rug and pretend they didn't happen, so you just have to ignore them, right? And rehabilitation by omission is when you omit the facts. So, in the case of Richard Milhouse Nixon, you omit the fact that he overthrew the government of Chile using a military coup. You omit the fact that he destroyed most of Lyndon Johnson's Great Society programs. You omit the fact that Richard Nixon did a genocide in Cambodia. You omit the fact that Richard Nixon sabotaged peace talks in Vietnam. You omit the fact that Richard Nixon spied on people, had a long blacklist, a list of enemies. You omit the fact that Richard Nixon used a Southern strategy to pull the Southern racists into the Republican Party. You omit the fact that Richard Nixon started the war on drugs, that he tried to nuke North Korea, that he had his foreign policy was among the worst, that Richard Nixon was literally probably the worst president based on the combination of all his policies. You omit all the facts and you say, Richard Nixon was really good, because I'm going to omit all the facts and I'll just say, so yeah, I should explain this a little better because it sounds confusing, omission and ignorance. So the way omission is different is that for Richard Nixon, people will acknowledge Watergate, his massive crimes cover up in Watergate, but they'll omit everything else. They'll only put the Watergate thing front and center. And the Watergate was bad, but there were many other bad things he did too, but they'll only put the one bad thing up in center, and then they'll omit all the other bad things. Like they'll just omit them. So they'll exclude them from consideration. Whereas for ignorance, in the case of George W. Bush, they'll acknowledge that all the things happened, but they'll choose to ignore them. And so it's similar, but there's a slight difference, if you will. Like going on to the third type, rehabilitation by lying, is when you just straight up lie about the person. So JFK, John Fitzgerald Kennedy, was president of the United States. He used chemical weapons on Vietnamese civilians. He was massively pro-war. He overthrew the Southern government, installed a dictatorial general who was very hawkish. And his policies in Vietnam were incredibly, well, they were just war crimes, flat out war crimes. Those were the policies. But anyway, the narrative about JFK now is that he wanted to pull the troops out of Vietnam, that he was pro-withdrawal, that he was somehow anti-war, and that's just a complete, flat-out BS lie. and it has fueled many conspiracy theory narratives. The truth is, JFK said that he would withdraw from Vietnam after victory. After victory. Which means basically we're just going to stay there forever. And what's victory? Victory is a very subjective term. Victory can maybe never be achieved depending on your viewpoint, or maybe it can be achieved. Like, there's no objective basis for victory. And Noam Chomsky was the one talking about this, how JFK is the one who said he would pull out after victory, and it was basically just code for he was going to try to stay there forever. So he was doing everything the intelligence agencies and the military-industrial complex wanted, and he was giving them everything they wanted. But people lie about him and say that he was actually anti-war and was going to pull the troops out, which is just a total lie. You're just flat out lying to rehabilitate the reputation of a war criminal. And also, rehabilitation by lying applies to someone like Dwight Eisenhower as well. For Dwight Eisenhower, the narrative is that he was anti-war and that he was totally against the military-industrial complex because he spoke out so bravely against them in that awesome speech. And the truth is, the speech was on his last day in office when he had been president for 8 years. On his last day, he wrote a verbal rhetorical speech criticizing the military-industrial complex, whose interests he had served for all his presidency. Remember, Dwight Eisenhower overthrew the government of Guatemala. Dwight Eisenhower did terror campaigns in Indonesia. Dwight Eisenhower started the permanent military occupation of South Korea. Dwight Eisenhower overthrew Prime Minister Mohammad Mossadegh of Iran. Dwight Eisenhower installed the dictator Shah Mohammad Reza Pahlavi in Iran. Because he wanted, of course, Iranian oil. And Dwight Eisenhower was the very first post-World War II president. Remember, all post-World War II presidents are war criminals. And now, but to clarify something really quick, FDR was president when World War II began, and World War II started 6 years into his presidency. The United States got involved in World War II 8 years into FDR's presidency, so 2 years into the war. FDR died 4 months before the end of the war. Harry Truman became president 4 months before the war ended, and during 4 months into Harry Truman's presidency, World War II ended, and Harry Truman was president for a total of 8 years. But Dwight Eisenhower was the very first post-World War II president, meaning he became president after World War II had ended. Just to be clear. So yeah, Dwight Eisenhower, first post-World War II president, massive asset to the military-industrial complex and its motives. But the narrative, the fake lie, is that Dwight Eisenhower was anti-war and totally against the military-industrial complex. So that's rehabilitation by lying. So as you can see, rehabilitation by ignorance, by omission, by lying, they all do overlap in a way, as I mentioned, with the ignorance and the omission. With ignorance, you have the facts right in front of you, like George W. Bush's war crimes and torture, but you just choose to ignore them, not look at them. With omission, you have certain things, true things that are presented to you, but you've omitted a bunch of other true things. Like you have the Watergate in front of you, like for Nixon, but you've omitted the regime change in Chile and the destruction of the Great Society programs and the war on drugs and the spying and all that stuff. So you've totally omitted them, excluded them from consideration. And rehabilitation by lying, you're just flat out lying and saying things that are fake to fuel your rehabilitation narrative. And one final note, if you're going to be rehabilitating people like JFK and Dwight Eisenhower and Richard Nixon, and to be clear, they are bad people and they're horrible, but George W. Bush is arguably worse than Eisenhower and Kennedy. Or I guess that could depend on relativity, because if you're from Iran, you might say Eisenhower's worse because he overthrew your government. If you're from Vietnam, you would say Kennedy's worse because he used chemical weapons on you. But if you're from Cambodia, you'll say Nixon is worse because he did a genocide on you. And then if you're from Iraq, you'll of course say Bush is worse because he illegally invaded your country. And then if you were in Guantanamo Bay, you'll say Bush is worse because but relatively speaking, if you're, so the neoliberals, the leftists, not leftist, excuse me, I misspoke. Neoliberals, liberals, the corporate Democrats love to rehabilitate Bush. And progressives rightfully call them out on that. And corporate Democrats love to rehabilitate Nixon, and progressives rightfully call them out on that. But progressives, on the other hand, have rehabilitated Kennedy by doing exactly what I described, by lying about his foreign policy, which was incredibly hawkish and totally against everything a progressive should stand for. And progressives have also rehabilitated Eisenhower using the lies I told you about. Um, so yeah, most progressives are excellent, but they should also, and they should continue to criticize the feckless, horrible corporate neoliberal Democrats who have rehabilitated the reputation of Bush and Nixon and others. But they should also, progressives should also be careful to stop rehabilitating Kennedy and Eisenhower and others. Food for thought.